Okay, so I am very pleased to introduce Bradford. Brad has been, you've made 4 trips to Miami in the last year. Yeah. And I hope you all have your wonderful notebooks with you. Yes? Those of you who do not, we have some paper here. Because actually the wonderful notebooks were instigated because Brad would like to have them. And because he wants you to be able to draw. And okay, so Brad is a professor of the College of Engineering, Architecture, and Computer Sciences at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He received his master's degree in architecture with a focus on social and cultural factors.
Could you talk now? Could you give your presentation voice?
It's time for the mic.
Sorry.
You give the microphone shade.
Oh, to heck with it. Close the computer, I'm not reading anything. So, in deciding who to bring to Deer Isle, who to have keynote for our 4 keynotes, the criteria was to bring some gifts to ACS, bring some gifts from ACS, and bring gifts to the community, and receive gifts from the community. And I would say that I think of Brad as a gift to ACS, and a gift to the community as well. Brad is a person who has an incredibly profound presence. And he's taught me a lot about presence in the last year. And he's going to talk about that process. Yeah. Enough said. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to receive introduction. I have really never quite received such a honor in an introduction. So I'm very pleased and much gratitude for being here, being able to speak with you for a few moments. I'm going to have a number of things that are happening, but I want to end by having you do an exercise. So Ben was correct. If you have your sketch pad or a drawing pad, if not, we'll figure out some piece of paper or some way. And if I don't go too long and we don't get too tired and dragged out, we'll do the exercise. If it looks like it doesn't feel like we should do the exercise, then we won't. We'll do the bonfire and drinks and all the other things that can happen. But I would like to start with just a few moments of silence. You can close your eyes, you can get comfortable, get in a position where you can just be still for a few moments. If you want to focus for a few moments on this wonderful mural that Bill and his posse developed, and go ahead and focus for a few minutes, or focus on these wonderful drawings, I believe, of shadows. Focus on that, but just for a few moments, just be still. Again, you can close your eyes, you can lower your eyes, you can just breathe. return your consciousness back. Open your eyes. Take one last glance. I often will start my classes in that manner. You can talk more about that. And so there's some tools that as I present, that I would like to offer with those of you who are in the teaching environment that you might be able to use. I would like to start. I'm going to start with about a 2.5 minute video, and then from this video go into a discussion about how I got involved in this idea of contemplative practice and using design, perhaps as an act of love. Talk about some ideas and techniques that's related to that, and end up with a project or just an exercise that I've been working on, a beholding project in there. And afterwards we'll then assemble ourselves for this drawing exercise, if you will allow me to. This video that I'm prepared to show is really a project that spoke to this idea of using love in the classroom. It's really a kind of a big term that oftentimes we feel reluctant to use to say the term love in a studio or in a classroom. Somehow that doesn't seem to be appropriate. And with funding from the Fetzer Foundation, that those of you may know, that speaks to this idea of love, compassion, and forgiveness, funded us an exercise to help in Haiti, post-earthquake Haiti, about 4 years ago. And this is a quick kind of summary of the students and I, along with Professor Lynn Dearborn from the University of Illinois, embarked in this project. And we'll run that as just a 2.5 minute video.
They get lost in it. They were completely lost for hours with their water and paint and sketchbook and the space they were in.
Just so happens that drawing is a skill that is traditional skills for architects, being able to draw. That's how we describe the world.
I like learning new things and applying my own style. I haven't done it since I was about 5 years old, and it seems a lot more difficult now.
So when you sketch and draw, obviously you have something on the paper, but it's really about looking, and I shouldn't even use the word looking, it's about seeing.
You can feel that your mind is slowing down, like you can really find something that you commonly won't realize.
The sketching, the drawing, the watercoloring is partly about being present where you are at that time.
I was sitting on a tire, the little children just sitting around me, and I could feel they can connect with me. It's like even we couldn't understand to each other, but I enjoyed that. It's really nice. It's wonderful.
That there's a reflective and meditative quality to drawing.
I've been doing a lot of watercoloring, which is kind of slowed down and more meditative compared to what we usually do, just cranking out on the computer the whole time. So I like that process of just kind of sitting down, sketching, throwing color over it if you'd like.
They're good data collection instruments now, right? It's not the camera that's the data collection instrument. They are. We've actually accomplished something because they stepped out of their world and into a totally different world.
Whitney Young, and many of you are aware of this, but Whitney Young was invited to the 1968 AIA convention. It was really one of the first times that an African-American professional was invited to speak at the convention, 1968. Whitney Young was the head of the Urban League, one of the two major civil rights organizations of the nation. In the Urban League, I can go into the background and the history of the Urban League, but they were really noted for working with the urban conditions, especially of African Americans and other folks of color. And it really gained prominence during the Great Migrations, the times that the African American community moved from the south to the north and really started to be part of the northern urban population. And Whitney Young headed up this organization, was invited to the AIA convention, and really admonished us as architects with his speech. This is one of the kind of the most noted part of his speech. You are not a profession that has distinguished itself by your social and civic contributions to the cause of civil rights. You're most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irreverence. And he admonished it, and shortly after the AIA, hopefully there's not many of you members of the AIA. Shortly after, the AIA decided to get on board. They offer some scholarship. They have the disadvantaged and minority scholarships and some other programs. And they did support the community design centers in many locations and so on. So it spurred the AIA. Interestingly enough, the latest AIA convention just happened a couple of weeks ago. Michelle Obama, first African-American woman to address the architects of our nations, was invited and spoke. I don't have a copy of her speech. I was wondering if she had some similar admonishments to our professions there. But this speech really highlights and really sparked my interest in this idea of using architecture and architectural education to not be silent, to really have a voice to speak, let our design work have a way of advancing. But most people, when they read or hear this, neglect this part. This became the more profound portion of Whitney Young's speech. We are ignorant in the art of living. And we probe and grasp the unique and ingenious ways. And when you say we, he's talking about we as architects. We probe and grasp the unique and ingenious ways to handle brick and mortar and glass, and most often forget such simple things as the Sermon on the Mount and the Golden Rule. And those of you steeped in the Christian tradition know that what the mountains of Galilee, the Sermon on the Mount, really sparks or really focuses on many of our Christian ethical principles, right? The Lord's Prayer was part of the Sermon on the Mount. The Gospels of Saint Matthew's, the Beatitudes were part of that sermon, and so it really spoke to this idea of love, forgiveness, compassion, and the ethical standards that should happen in Christian life. In the case of Jesus, speaking to the ethical principles of Christian life. But I think Young was moving onto something that we as architects also have forgotten, this idea of some ethical and some principles of compassion and love as we embark in our work. And so these are the kind of motivations that struck me and have spurred me to look deeper into this idea of a contemplative method as we work in architecture, design, and architectural education. My greatest influence, of course, are my mother and father, my parents. And my parents, many people ask me, well, Brad, how did you get involved, or what brought you to this direction in your work? And, obviously I have to reach to my parents. My father was a Baptist minister. He's deceased about 3 years ago. My mother's still alive. She's very spiritual, religious, and kind of shored me up with that kind of instruction. Yes, I'm a preacher's kid. And although I rebelled that kind of position for many years, it really was a great influence to me. My mother to this day wakes up in the morning and does her affirmations. She has a special room in the house where she kind of does her affirmations and reads the Bible and pray and so on. This kind of tiny room. This room is amazing. She has these plants in here and they grow wild. The plants growing. In fact, she has a number of African violets in this room. And as you know, African violets are a little bit tricky to grow oftentimes. You go into my mother's prayer room, affirmation room, and these African violets are, just thriving, and so much so that neighbors will come over when their African violets are not doing very well and ask if they can keep it in this prayer room for a bit so they can receive this, makes you a believer real quick. But along with that, after her prayer routine, she moves into the front room where she plays the piano. And she starts playing these pianos. She was a gospel pianist for a number of years, and she plays these piano music all in the morning. I'm in the bed. When I go visit her, I'm still, asleep in the bed, but I can always count on that piano music to kind of gently wake me up. It's a deep and wonderful kind of memory. But the other kind of influence to me happened in my embarking in professional practice after graduating, going to school, graduating and embarking in professional practice, working for a large architecture firm, MBT in San Francisco, Gerald McHugh and Tom Sick, involved in a large architectural practice, doing a lot of corporate buildings, and there were two experiences that just struck me in that world. I was asked to be on the design team to help design a pharmaceutical corporation for the Syntex Corporation. Pharmaceutical Corporation. This is in Palo Alto, California. Syntex was noted for developing. There's a question if they invented it, but developing the birth control pill. So their pharmaceutical company that was noted for birth control pill, and at the time we were working on it, they were battling this kind of battle of dumping, where they would dump the pills that the Federal Drug Administration wouldn't accept, and they would dump them to South America oftentimes, and so on and so forth, which was disturbing as I'm working on this, again, trying to negotiate this ethical principle as a designer. But they placed me on the laboratory animal holding facility, right? And I was never kind of an animal rights person, and until I started designing the jails for animals. I call them designing animal jails. And then finding that, in fact, some of the codes and the instructions of designing animal jails were far superior than the codes and instructions for designing jail cells for humans. As you well know, to experiment with animals, primates, we were making cells for primates, dogs, cats, and mouse, rats, mouse. And in order to experiment with laboratory animals, they have to be extremely healthy, right? If you're going to make them sick, you have to start out with extremely healthy animals. To make the animals extremely healthy, they have to have a very healthy environment. And we were designing these extremely wonderful, healthy environments for the animal holding facilities that were far, I thought, superior to how we treated our incarcerated individuals. So that drove me nuts. And then I think the last straw was when they signed me to do reflected ceiling plans. The reflected these big corporate buildings. This is one example of reflected ceiling plan. And it was boring and didn't seem like taking advantage of my extreme design abilities and so on. But I got into a zen as I was drafting these reflected and designing these reflected ceiling plans. And I love the idea that the reflected ceiling plan is really drawing as though you have a mirror. And you look down at the mirror, which reflects the ceiling above. And this whole idea of reflections and looking down when I'm drawing up, and up is down, and so it became a very zen, a meditative process for me as I was drawing these ceilings, and ceilings worked very well to kind of get me, and I was now enjoying, ready to come to work on these reflected ceiling plans, and I had a whole philosophical kind of basis on that. And then many folks have been asking, and really a big part of me, and it was part of the introduction, is my involvement with the Center for the Contemplative Mind and Society. And if you allow me to talk a little bit about that, I would like to. It's a center that we have now focused on contemplative practices in higher education. So our whole focus is really related to higher education. Not necessarily design education, but higher education in general. And it's really talking about educating the whole person, the inner and the outer, and really what that means as an educated person beyond the technical knowledge that we might focus on. It's a wonderful organization, and the membership includes many of our colleagues in the academic ranks, not necessarily in the design portion. Probably very few of us in the design portion are involved in that, but wonderful. We have an annual conference. We're coming up on our 20th anniversary this fall. We have a conference in Scotts Valley, California, outside of Santa Cruz, California. I encourage you to get on the website, get on the website if you want to be involved or submit a proposal. Proposals are still being accepted for this conference. It's going to be hosted at the 1440 complex. 1440 is a new complex, a new kind of retreat for facilities in Santa Cruz, started by a bunch of wealthy Silicon Valley folks who are very much mindful and into contemplative practice. But it's an interesting organization. After the lecture or the talk, those of you who are interested, we can talk more about it and some of my experiences. But it's been a really powerful, and let me just say, I got involved. I didn't know anything about the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society until I walked. They solicited ideas from professors. This was several years ago. Professors who were working to instill a type of contemplative practice in their classroom instructions. I was just teaching design studio, and some elective courses. I didn't know, and so I investigated it, and I found that, the very nature of design, especially design studio instruction, is about contemplative practice. You can't do a very impressive, important, meaningful design studio without some type of contemplative, meaningful, reflective, thoughtful practice. And I thought to myself, I'm doing this anyway. What they're asking for is what I'm doing. Let me write up a proposal and do it. And sure enough, they said, you're doing what we've been really seeking. The design field is primed for instructing others how to be mindful, how to be really focused on contemplative practice in education. And so as we talk about this idea of contemplative practice in design education, especially with the idea of drawing, and as I say, seeing, as the video talks about, this idea of seeing and drawing, we see that drawing, designing is really about observing and looking and seeing and understanding the world. Now, there's a lot of conversation and interesting debates about what seeing really is, right? And so there's, seeing is about the eyes and the hands, but there's also this kind of alternative or additional thoughts about seeing. So the blind also see. They see by feeling. So the senses really aren't the determining factors of what seeing is about. Because you can see with your fingers, or many people can see with their ears. There's a lot of experiments about seeing what you're seeing through hearing, seeing through feeling. And so this idea, so ultimately seeing is really what happens in the brain. What happens in the brain and how it gets into the brain. Now the experiments that talk about how sight enters into the brain is very important, because we find that getting information into the brain via the digital means oftentimes is not the most creative and effective. And there's a number of experiments and research that have established that, where they put the electrodes and see what activates which parts of the brains. And they found that one such research that found that elementary school kids that start to learn how to write the alphabet. I'm of the generation, we had these big, fat pencils and the big paper, and we were doing our A, B, C's, and so on. Activated a part of the brain that really talks to creativity and imagination. And kids that learn the alphabet digitally, either by the keyboard or some other digital method, seem to activate a different part of the brain, not so much the imaginative, creative side. Now, we don't know what that eventually means, but there really is some effects of how we get to this part of our brain in terms of seeing. This idea of designing and seeing, especially drawing, is also about becoming aware. Right? You become greatly aware when you just slow down with your pencil and pen and draw and look at your subject. I really enjoy this idea of acknowledgement of the existence, right? The very fact that you see something or want to draw something, or the blade of grass, the very fact that you want to utilize or pay attention really acknowledges that existence that we oftentimes, along with that, this idea of the commonplace, the epiphany of the commonplace, the looking at the blade of grass, that is, we see it all the time, it's common, but to really see this, and again, acknowledging that and celebrating that becomes very, very important. And become what you see. As you're designing, I don't know if you do this, as I'm designing, certainly when I draw, I actually talk to my subject, right? So I talk to the blade of grass. Louis Kahn talked to his buildings, right? He has this whole kind of dialogue about the materials, what do you want to be? Well, brick, I want to be an arch. That kind of thing. That you really become that. In fact, that's one of the exercises I do with my students. I have them create a conversation with their design. What do you want to be? And have them write that whole script, have that whole conversation, become what they see, become what they design. And then lastly, imbuing dignity. I mean, there's something very dignified and really imbuing this dignity when you select a subject or designing a building or drawing and seeing a subject that you're working with. It gives it great dignity. Now, oftentimes students rely on, and many of us in the educational community understand this, oftentimes we rely on signs and symbols, right? They don't really see, they just jump to the signs and symbols. Signs and symbols are very easy to understand and quick, and that's the nature of them. That's the reason we have. You don't have to have a lot of intelligence, a lot of skills. You understand the nature of signs and symbols. This happened to be the West African Ankh that talks about life and so on. So even culturally, different cultures have their signs and symbols that represent various elements. And one of the things, again, that is very clear with many of our beginning architecture students, design students, is trying to get away from the signs and symbols. So a flower can be oftentimes portrayed by those who are not very aware as just kind of a symbol. And I don't know if you've tried these exercises to describe or illustrate concepts of love or friendship and so on, and then here comes the symbol of a flower or a heart or others. And oftentimes they will look at this field of daisies, and you ask them to draw them to create a understanding of them, and you'll get a very simplistic kind of design versus really looking at the daisies and understanding them, becoming them, seeing them, honoring them, so on, where you can start to describe exactly what's happening. The daisy as a flower simply is what it is in all its form. And then also our students and many of us, as we talk about understanding and seeing this idea of illusions, right? And there's a number of these. Is this the question? Do you see the question mark, or do you see the stylized Batman swan? What do you see? Why do you see? And what does that mean in terms of our function of our perception in our brain? Which way is it going? How is that manifest in what we're working with? And so I like to tackle that, and I work with my students. Oftentimes the Washington Post in their magazines will have this, what they call second glance, and they'll put 2 photographs out and they're asked, the challenge is to find the 12 different changes from the top to the bottom photograph. And you really have to observe and deeply look to start to do this. It's very good training, I find, for my students and certainly for myself. And some of them could be very tricky. I mean, they could be very subtle changes. And here, we won't go to the 12. You notice that there's a logo on the shirt on this one. There's not a logo on the shirt on that. Those kinds. So you look through this photograph and you'll see these changes. But you have to start now not just glancing or using the patterns that our minds often create for us. You have to really start to see. And they come each week. The students don't like it. Oh, Professor Grant, you're gonna, you know. But they start to get used to it, and it starts to focus their attention on seeing. And one of the aspects that I love in terms of, many of you do this, certainly in foundation design and beginning design, is this idea of the negative. You know, this is the kind of Betty Edwards, draw the negative space and so on. I really love that. It has a lot of deep meaning, and again, it's almost, for me, related to the reflected ceiling plan. I get all philosophical about this idea of negative space. In fact, there's a wonderful article. Let me just jump back. The Center for Contemplative Mind and Society publishes a peer-reviewed e-journal. And recently, well, not so recently, a while back, there was a wonderful article by Renee Hill called The Positive of the Negative, that talks about, she heard me talk about my love of the negative space, and really, she's a psychologist, philosopher, and wrote a wonderful essay about the positive of the negative, based on this idea of Betty Edwards' negative space. Many of you use that, and the idea is to try to avoid or not focus on the positive image, but see the space between and draw the space between to describe that. And again, that's something that many of us do in architectural education. But it has, again, for me, a profound effect. I find it very powerful for the students. I think others find it very successful. I can go on and on again about the philosophical and the kind of cultural connections with the negative space. In fact, the idea of calling it the negative space, especially when you're in a cultural context, can have some meaning also. And so I use that. This is Pretoria, South Africa, Freedom Park in South Africa. Those of you who have been there, and this particular plaza speaks to honoring and the grave sites of many of the heroes of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And it's a wonderful outdoor landscape. Hopefully, many of you will have, if you haven't, the opportunity to go there. But I was there, and I used, it was profoundly helpful for me to use this idea of drawing that using the negative space. So the spaces between the gravestones became important for me as I was crafting and constructing this, and was able to really utilize that in the proportions and so on. It seemed to work out well. It became very instrumental as part of my bag of tricks of trying to sketch and draw and understand the environment in a way that I may not in other ways. Other elements that you know of and that I work with is this idea of shades and shadows and the light and so on. Again, I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about it. Again, I get really philosophical about the light, the sun, the absence of light and the shadows, and I find it very interesting because our students are so connected, or at least the students I've experienced are so connected to the digital world, to the analog world. They even forget that there's things that rotate, that the earth rotates, and that we're going around the sun, and what that means in terms of casting shadows and light. And so a combination, this is a sketch I did with the students who were out in Washington, D.C. is a wonderful laboratory to do that. The National Archives, the spaces between the columns, the light, the dark, and what that can mean and how that can be portrayed as we walk through the city with our sketchbooks become extremely important. I'll give you a second to read this. This is kind of the attitude that many of us face when trying to draw. Right? And we'll find that this is one of the reasons that many of us are shut down to drawing, because we have experienced some form of this comic strip. And there's so much dependence on rules and how you're supposed to produce what you're supposed to, the product versus the process and so on. And we have to get beyond that. That really needs to happen. And these attitudes, what I call 7 attitudes, will need to be instructive as we work to get beyond that. This idea of non-judging, or no judgment, no judgment. Now, how do you do that when you're a classroom teacher, professor, and so on? Is again worth another discussion. But certainly, that's part of this idea of patience, taking your time and slowing down. I love this idea, a very Eastern philosophical idea of the beginner's mind, just starting anew, discovering it all for yourself and not worrying. Trust. And this trust, at least for my students, it talks about self-confidence also, and building up their confidence so they can trust themselves as they design and go through the process, that they really have this. In fact, one of my primary kind of starting points with this idea of design as an act of love is that you have to love yourself first. I do have students that tend not to love themselves. You have to love themselves. You have to have confidence. You have to trust yourself before we can move forward. Non-striving, letting go, accepting whatever conditions, wherever you are. Again, and just letting go, having fun. And so I think Dennis the Menace really kind of expresses it the best here. You have to have rules, Joey. Otherwise, everything would be fun. And and the idea is to have fun. And we shouldn't have rules to take the fun away from and the enjoyment from this idea of our endeavor of the design process and the design work. I want to take you through a series. I've just started recently, you can see, I think this is in March, late in March, to do a beholding exercise on a tree that's on my campus. And so I decided to try to draw this tree, sit down and really use it as a meditative site and draw this tree every day. This kind of behold this tree every day. Now wasn't able to do it every day. Sometimes it was raining and sometimes, I got caught up with a meeting at school or whatever. But I attempted to do it every day. And I'm going to show you a series. So I have a number of these in my sketchbook, but I'm not going to bore you with all of my trees. And I neglected, the professorial part of me talks about scale and this and that. But again, no judgment, let go. It was my time to meditate, to just really spend time with this tree. It's a little bit, at first it was a little bit awkward on my campus. This is on campus, so students would see me, Professor Grant, what are you doing? And that kind of thing. But then it became instructive, because I could make that a teaching moment, a learning moment. And you could tell them. And I decided as I do these trees, I would, do them, maybe try a different technique or do something different. I can just explore, just be free. I can do the same tree in different ways, see it differently. And just sit down and really, I use this as a contemplative moment. And then right around April 18th, what was nice, the leaves started to bud there. I saw a few of them budding. And that's when I started talking to the tree. I would sit there and it became my tree. This is my tree. And I would talk to it, I would greet it. This happens to be on the way to the architecture building. So it became my tree. And I could see how it's growing, and I could start to take a look at some of the details of the leaves, and what that really means for me. More of the leaves happening. Again, I can play around with different ways of looking at that and playing around. And these sketches didn't take necessarily a long or large amount of time. It actually increased as the leaves increased. More time as the increased. And previously, I really didn't quite like drawing winter trees. I thought they were just kind of barren and stark and so on. But they were quick to draw. And as the leaves kind of gathered, they became more and more difficult. So this is the kind of, and then my last one, I haven't been able to do one since the 8th of May, but I did it with my left hand, my non-dominant hand. That's another, we all know that exercise. In fact, we might even do that. My non-dominant hand. And it took me a little more time than I normally would use, but I was so pleased to sit down with my other hand and be able to talk to my tree and draw my tree. And as part of this kind of honoring this belonging to the tree, I want to end this portion. And by the way, this is the tree. This is the tree on the campus.
Good tree.
I want to end by playing a tribute, a song, and it's a poem, Tree, by Joyce Kilman. Her poetry, Trees. But it's sung, and many of you know this poem. And it's sung, and I have a recording. We're gonna, and I want you to meditate and be with this. And it's a recording by Paul Robeson, the great African-American activist who really received a lot of acclaim for his stage acting. He's a bass and baritone singer. He became a Pan-Africanist. Was banned from the country for a while. He was claimed that he was accused of being a communist during the Red Scare and so on. But acclaimed vocalist Paul Robeson. So please indulge me and sit with this here. Oops. Do that. Some reference books, we can talk about that later. Thank you. Now this is a good time to escape. But I would like to, if you don't mind, to do maybe just one exercise. Can we do one exercise, drawing exercise? This is an exercise that you need to have a sketchbook or paper and pen or something like that. And it's an exercise that we're gonna have to kind of switch around, move around. Maybe if we can hit the lights.
I'm just giving you.
And anybody have an extra pen?
An extra pen, pencil, anybody need a paper?
Bill, you have some extra drawing.
There's some pencils and graphite.
There's some,
Yeah.
I think there's some drawing.
Anybody else? Anybody else? A little paper? Favorite.
Anybody want a pencil?